fishermen spot something on an iceberg and get closer to investigate. The freezing winds of the North Atlantic howled as Captain Thomas Tommy Hayes guided his small fishing vessel, the Mariner's Hope, through the icy waters off the coast of Maine. The crew, a tight-knit group of 4, battled the chill with laughter and shared stories of warmer days. But their camaraderie shattered when young Sam, the deckhand, yelled, "Captain, look at that iceberg." Tommy squinted at the horizon, where a massive block of ice drifted ominously. It wasn't the iceberg itself that caught their attention, but a dark, unnatural shape embedded in it. Against his better judgment, Tommy steered the boat closer, the weight of curiosity pulling him toward a mystery that would change their lives forever. As the boat approached, the crew's excitement turned to unease. The shape inside the ice grew clearer, revealing a haunting silhouette, something that looked human, yet distorted, almost otherworldly. Tommy felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The ice cracked slightly under the boat's vibrations, and a muffled sound echoed, a sound too rhythmic to be natural. "We shouldn't be here," muttered Dave, the oldest of the crew, his voice trembling. "This feels wrong." But Sam, always eager for adventure, leaned over the edge of the boat with a flashlight, illuminating the dark figure. It's a man," he exclaimed, his voice a mix of awe and terror. The others exchanged uneasy glances, debating what to do. Tommy, torn between his responsibility as captain and the gnawing feeling that this discovery was something beyond their understanding, made the call. "We'll bring it aboard." The crew worked together to hoist the frozen block of ice, its sheer weight and eerie contents making every move feel monumental. As the block settled on the deck, a sharp crack split the air, and the ice began to break apart. The figure inside seemed to shimmer under the flashlight's beam, its features more distinct now. A man, indeed, but with eyes closed and skin too pale to be alive. Yet something about him felt alive. "Tommy," whispered Dave, gripping the captain's arm. "This isn't just some lost sailor. Look at his clothes, they're not from this century." Tommy's breath caught as he noticed the intricate, almost futuristic patterns on the man's suit. The realization struck like a tidal wave. They hadn't just pulled a man from the ice, they had awakened something that didn't belong to their world. The atmosphere aboard the Mariner's Hope shifted from unease to palpable dread as the frozen figure began to thaw. Sam's curiosity burned brighter than the fear in his chest. "Captain, we should check for signs of life," he suggested, his voice trembling but resolute. Tommy hesitated, glancing at the rest of the crew. Dave shook his head vehemently, while Mark, the quietest of them, merely stared at the figure, transfixed. Sam grabbed a crowbar to break the remaining ice. As the shards fell away, the man's features became hauntingly clear: high cheekbones, a clean-shaven face, and closed eyes that seemed almost too peaceful. His suit, sleek and metallic, shimmered faintly under the deck lights. Tommy finally relented. "All right, but be careful." When the last of the ice gave way, the man's body slumped slightly, as though gravity was reintroducing itself to him. Sam leaned in, pressing 2 fingers to the stranger's neck. There's a pulse," he shouted, his voice laced with disbelief. The crew recoiled in shock. A man frozen in ice, possibly for decades, maybe centuries, was alive? Before anyone could process the revelation, the man's eyes fluttered open. A collective gasp escaped the crew. His gaze was sharp, almost predatory, as if he were scanning them, evaluating their worth. He opened his mouth to speak, but the sound that emerged was unlike anything they'd ever heard, a low, guttural hum that sent chills down their spines. What is he saying?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. Tommy stepped closer, his instincts screaming at him to stay away. The man's expression shifted to frustration, then determination, as he pointed a finger to his throat and shook his head. Sam, ever the problem solver, grabbed a blanket and wrapped it around the man, hoping to calm him. "Captain," he said softly, "I don't think he's from here." The man's gaze darted around the boat as if he were trying to orient himself in a world he didn't recognize. Sam continued to hover nearby, offering reassurances the stranger couldn't understand. The rhythmic hums from his throat shifted in tone and pitch, forming patterns that almost resembled words but remained indecipherable. Maybe he's trying to communicate, Sam suggested, glancing back at the others. Tommy folded his arms, still keeping a cautious distance. Or maybe he's trying to lure us into something we don't want to be part of, Dave shot back, his mistrust thick in the air. The stranger raised a hand, gesturing toward his chest, then pointed to the stars glimmering faintly through the cloudy night sky. The motion was deliberate, almost ritualistic. The crew stared, confusion and fear mingling in their expressions. Stars, Mark murmured. He's pointing at the stars. What if he's not from here? Sam said, the words hanging in the air like frost. Tommy shot him a sharp look. You mean not from Earth? The absurdity of the idea clashed with the undeniable evidence in front of them. The man's suit, his alien-like hums, and the strange glow that now pulsed faintly from his skin. Before anyone could respond, the man's hum deepened, vibrating through the boat like a low-frequency tremor. He pressed his hands to the deck, and the vibrations intensified. Suddenly, the lights on the vessel flickered, and the engines sputtered to a halt. What the hell is he doing? Dave yelled, panic creeping into his voice. Tommy grabbed a wrench and stepped closer, his instincts as a protector overpowering his fear. If you're here to hurt us, we won't go down without a fight, he warned, voice steady despite the chaos. The stranger's hum ceased as abruptly as it began. The lights steadied, and the engine gave a weak sputter before dying completely. Silence cloaked the deck, save for the soft lapping of waves against the hull. Tommy tightened his grip on the wrench, his heart pounding like a war drum. The man turned his gaze to the captain, his expression calm yet unervingly resolute, and placed a hand over his own chest in a gesture that felt both apologetic and urgent. Captain, wait, Sam pleaded, stepping between Tommy and the stranger. I don't think he's trying to hurt us. Look at him, he's just as scared as we are. Tommy hesitated, his eyes searching the stranger's face for any sign of malice. There was none. Instead, the man pointed to the sky again, this time more frantically, as though time itself were slipping away. Why the stars? Mark murmured, stepping closer despite his own fear. It's like he's trying to tell us something about them. The stranger nodded fervently, his movements growing more animated. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached into a concealed pocket in his suit, pulling out a small orb-like device that glowed faintly in his hand. What the hell is that? Dave barked, taking a step back. The stranger held the orb aloft, and suddenly, a projection flickered to life above it. A hologram of a planet, Earth, rotated serenely in the air, but it wasn't alone. Beside it hovered another celestial body, one darkened by an ominous red glow. The projection zoomed in, revealing swirling storms and jagged fissures that seemed to devour the surface. The crew stared in stunned silence as the stranger pointed to the darkened planet, then back to the stars. He gestured toward the ocean surrounding them, his urgency mounting. I think he's saying something's coming, Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper. And it's bad. The man nodded, his glowing skin now pulsing in a steady rhythm. It was as if his very body was a warning beacon. Tommy lowered the wrench, his instincts screaming that this was bigger than anything they'd ever encountered. All right, he said, his voice gruff but steady. We'll listen. But you'd better pray we're not making a mistake. The hologram dissolved into the cold night air, leaving the crew grappling with the weight of what they had just witnessed. Tommy turned to the stranger, who now sat cross-legged on the deck, the orb still glowing faintly in his hands. If he's warning us about something, we need to know more, Tommy muttered. But how could they understand someone who spoke only in hums and gestures? Sam crouched beside the stranger, studying the orb. Maybe this thing can tell us more, he said, reaching out hesitantly. As his fingers brushed the surface, the orb flared to life again, projecting a string of symbols that floated and rotated like a living language. The stranger pointed to the symbols, then to the crew, as though encouraging them to interpret. They're not letters, Mark said, his voice shaking. They're coordinates? The realization hit like a lightning bolt. He's showing us a location, Sam added, his excitement tinged with apprehension. Tommy stepped closer, his captain's instincts wrestling with the absurdity of the situation. A location for what? An answer? A warning? Before anyone could speculate further, the stranger placed the orb on the deck and gestured for Tommy to follow him to the helm. There, he pointed toward the horizon, his glowing skin pulsing in a rhythm that seemed to align with the projection's coordinates. "He wants us to take him somewhere," Sam said, interpreting the silent plea. "Captain, we should go." Dave slammed his hand against the rail. "Are you all insane? We don't even know what he is, let alone where he's leading us. For all we know, this could be a trap." Tommy locked eyes with the stranger, searching for some semblance of truth. The man's expression, though alien, radiated urgency and desperation. Against every logical impulse, Tommy made his decision. "Start the backup engine," he ordered. "We're going where he wants us to go." The backup engine roared to life, breaking the oppressive silence that had settled over the crew. The mariner's hope began to move, cutting through the icy waters under the stranger's silent guidance. Tommy stayed at the helm, his hands gripping the wheel tighter than ever before. He glanced occasionally at the glowing coordinates on the orb, now resting in the stranger's lap. The alien hums had stopped, but their eerie resonance lingered in the captain's mind. "What are we walking into?" he muttered under his breath. Behind him, the crew gathered, their unease evident in their hushed conversations. Sam, ever the optimist, clung to the belief that the stranger meant no harm. "He saved us," he argued, pointing to the orb and the mysterious warning. "If whatever he's warning us about is real, then maybe he's trying to stop it." Mark nodded reluctantly but kept his distance from the stranger. Dave, on the other hand, remained staunchly skeptical. "This is madness," he grumbled. "We don't owe this thing anything. For all we know, he brought that danger here in the first place." His words hung in the air, challenging anyone to prove him wrong. As the boat sliced through the water, the horizon began to change. A dense fog rolled in, thicker than anything they'd encountered before. It clung to the vessel, muffling sounds and obscuring their view. The stranger suddenly rose, his glowing hand pointing toward a faint light shimmering in the mist. "Captain, look!" Sam called out, his voice a mix of awe and apprehension. Tommy squinted, steering cautiously toward the light. The closer they got, the more the fog seemed to part, revealing what lay ahead, a massive structure, half submerged in the ocean. The structure was unlike anything they'd ever seen. It looked ancient yet impossibly advanced, with spires of black metal that jutted out at odd angles. Strange, glowing symbols pulsated along its surface, mirroring the patterns on the stranger's suit. The crew stood frozen, their disbelief mingling with a growing sense of dread. "What is that?" Mark finally whispered, breaking the spell. The stranger stepped forward, his expression resolute, and gestured for the crew to follow him toward the edge of the ship. Tommy hesitated, the weight of his decisions pressing harder than ever. "We're not equipped for this," he said, his voice low but firm. "We're fishermen, not explorers. Whatever this is, it's way out of our depth." But even as he spoke, he felt the pull of the unknown, the undeniable truth that they'd been brought here for a reason. The stranger turned to him, his glowing eyes locking onto Tommy's. Without words, he conveyed a single, urgent plea: "Trust me." Against all logic, Tommy nodded. "Lower the lifeboat," he ordered. "We're going in." The lifeboat descended into the dark, churning waters, its small frame dwarfed by the towering structure ahead. Tommy, Sam, and the stranger climbed aboard while Dave and Mark stayed behind to guard the mariner's hope. The fog seemed to close in tighter around them as they rowed closer, each stroke of the oars echoing ominously. The structure loomed larger with every passing second, its jagged edges gleaming faintly in the dim light. Tommy kept his eyes on the stranger, who sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the towering spires. "What do you think this place is?" Sam whispered, his voice barely carrying over the sound of the water. Tommy shook his head. "I don't know. But it's not natural." The closer they got, the more the details of the structure became clear. Strange, organic shapes intertwined with the metal, as though it were part machine, part living organism. The glowing symbols pulsed in a rhythmic pattern, almost like a heartbeat. Sam's hand trembled as he reached for the edge of the lifeboat, his curiosity warring with his fear. As they reached the base of the structure, the stranger gestured for them to stop. He stood and placed his hand on one of the glowing symbols, the light intensifying under his touch. The metal beneath them groaned and shifted, revealing an entrance that led into the heart of the structure. A wave of warm air rushed out, carrying with it a faint, unearthly hum. Tommy's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but the stranger stepped forward without hesitation, motioning for them to follow. "This is insane," Sam muttered, glancing nervously at Tommy. "We don't know what's in there." Tommy hesitated for a moment, then steeled himself. "We didn't come this far to stop now. Stay close and don't touch anything." The three stepped into the structure, their footsteps echoing in the vast, hollow space. The walls glowed faintly, casting strange, shifting shadows that made the air feel alive. Inside, the hum grew louder, reverberating through their chests. The corridor led to a large chamber filled with floating orbs similar to the one the stranger carried. Each orb projected different scenes. Some showed Earth as they knew it, while others depicted apocalyptic visions of destruction. Sam stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening in horror. "Captain," he whispered, pointing to an orb. It showed a massive wave of fire engulfing a city, and above it, a shadowy figure hovered, its form eerily similar to the stranger's. The chamber seemed to pulse with life, its glowing walls and floating orbs casting an ethereal light on the crew. Tommy stared at the apocalyptic scene in the orb Sam had pointed to, his gut twisting with unease. The image of the shadowy figure, so similar to their mysterious passenger, lingered in his mind. "What does this mean?" he muttered, turning to the stranger. "Is this a warning or a threat?" The stranger stepped forward, his movements deliberate. He extended his hand toward the orb, and as his fingers brushed its surface, the image shifted. The fiery devastation faded, replaced by a serene view of Earth from space. Below it, glowing lines appeared, connecting points across the globe like a web. The stranger pointed to the network, then to himself, his glowing skin pulsing in time with the lines. "I think he's saying he's part of this, whatever it is," Sam said, his voice trembling. "Maybe he's trying to stop the destruction we saw." Tommy clenched his fists, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. If he's part of it, then why was he frozen in ice? Why didn't he stop it before it got to this point? The stranger's expression darkened, his eyes reflecting an emotion that Tommy couldn't quite place: regret. He gestured to another orb, this one showing a barren landscape. Cracked earth stretched as far as the eye could see, and the sky was a sickly shade of red. In the distance, machines moved like predators, hunting the last remnants of life. "That's not Earth," Mark said softly, his voice crackling over the radio from the ship. He and Dave had been following the conversation over their handheld device. "It's another planet." The realization struck the crew like a hammer blow. The stranger wasn't just warning them about Earth's future, he had seen this kind of destruction before, possibly on his own world. The stranger's hum returned, low and mournful. He touched his chest, then pointed to the barren planet, his movements slow and deliberate. Tommy's breath caught. "It happened to him," he whispered. "That's his home." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, their fear giving way to a deeper understanding. The stranger wasn't their enemy. He was a survivor, a refugee fleeing from a catastrophe he was desperate to prevent from happening again. The chamber seemed to grow colder as the realization settled over them. Sam took a hesitant step toward the stranger. "If that's true," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes, "then we have to help him. Whatever it takes." Tommy nodded slowly, the captain's resolve hardening. "All right," he said. "But we need to know how. And we need to know now." The stranger turned toward the central chamber, where the largest orb hovered in the air, glowing with an intensity that outshone the others. He moved with purpose, his glowing skin pulsating faster as he placed both hands on the orb's surface. A brilliant light filled the room, forcing Tommy and Sam to shield their eyes. When it dimmed, the orb projected an intricate display, a star map. Lines connected constellations to form a grid, and in the center was Earth, encircled by a glowing red halo. The stranger pointed to the halo, then to the spires of the structure they now stood in. He gestured toward the glowing symbols etched into the walls, his movements frantic and deliberate. Sam's face lit up with realization. The symbols, there's some kind of controls, he exclaimed. This isn't just a structure. It's a machine. Tommy stared at the projection, his mind racing. A machine for what? To stop whatever's coming? The stranger nodded, his glowing skin flaring brighter in what seemed like confirmation. But before anyone could respond, the orb's projection shifted again, showing Earth engulfed by the same fiery storm they had seen earlier. This time, however, it focused on a specific location, a point in the ocean not far from their current position. That's where it'll start, Mark's voice crackled over the radio. Whatever this thing is warning us about, it's going to begin there. Tommy's jaw tightened. Then we don't have much time, he said, his voice grim. We need to activate this machine. But as they turned to the walls, their glowing symbols began to fade, the light dimming as if the structure itself were dying. The stranger's hum deepened, growing louder and more resonant. He placed his hand on his chest, then gestured to the symbols, his glowing form radiating urgency. Sam frowned, his eyes darting between the stranger and the machine. Captain, he said hesitantly, I think it needs him to power it. Tommy froze, the implication sinking in. You mean? Sam nodded grimly. He's connected to this somehow. If we activate it, it might mean, he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. The stranger's glowing eyes met Tommy's, and in that moment, the captain understood. This wasn't just a warning, it was a choice. The stranger was prepared to sacrifice himself to stop the impending disaster. The weight of that realization settled over Tommy like an anchor, but he knew what he had to do. All right, he said quietly, his voice heavy with resolve. Let's finish this. The silence in the chamber was deafening as Tommy, Sam, and the stranger stood before the glowing machine, the weight of the decision before them almost unbearable. The stranger stepped forward, his glowing skin casting eerie shadows against the cold walls. The hum resonated through the air again, a low, mournful sound that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. The machine pulsed faintly, but without the stranger's touch, it was inert, powerless. He turned back to Tommy and Sam, his expression full of silent pleading. This is it, Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. He was no longer sure if he was speaking to himself or to the stranger. This is the end of the road for him. If he powers it up, he might never come back. Tommy swallowed hard, feeling the weight of that truth pressing against his chest. They had come this far together, but the price for saving Earth could be the stranger's life. And they had no guarantee of success. The stranger placed his hands on the glowing symbols on the wall, and immediately, a pulse of energy shot through the structure, lighting up the room. The walls hummed louder, shaking with power. Sam's breath caught in his throat as the machine seemed to come alive. It's working, he said in disbelief. It's really working. But even as he spoke, a chill ran down his spine. The stars outside the chamber, visible through a crack in the ceiling, seemed to darken, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Tommy took a step forward, his voice breaking the tense silence. You don't have to do this, he said, looking directly at the stranger. We'll find another way. We can stop this together. The stranger shook his head slowly, his glowing eyes locked onto Tommy's with an intensity that was both sad and resolute. He reached out, placing one glowing hand on Tommy's shoulder, his touch light but firm. The hum in his chest grew louder, almost as if it were a final goodbye. With a deep, reluctant sigh, Tommy nodded. You don't have to say it, he said softly. I get it. The stranger's final hum was not mournful, but full of resolve. He turned back to the machine, his hands pressing firmly into the control symbols. The energy surged, and the light within the structure grew blinding. Tommy and Sam shielded their eyes, and for one long, breathless moment, the entire world seemed to pause. The stranger's form began to dissolve, his body becoming one with the machine. And in that moment, as the light reached its peak, they knew Earth's fate was no longer in their hands.